Okay, alright. The second time I film it, I don't know what's going on. Okay. Anyways, this is Pride and Prejudice, Volume 2, Chapter 4. Um, so the plans were made for Elizabeth to go to Hunsford, where Mr. Collins and Charlotte live. She was not looking forward to it, but Charlotte kind of she planned it and she really wanted her to go. Elizabeth was to go with Sir William, Charlotte's dad, and his second daughter, Maria. They also planned on staying a night at London, which Elizabeth was happy about because she gets to see Jane and her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. She bids adieu, which is bye, to her father, who will miss her very much, and to Wickham, who still lives an amiable impression on her. Foreshadowing? Okay. On her trip there, she finds Sir William to be nothing much to say, and Maria to be very, I don't want to be very empty-headed. Like, her humor isn't good, and that kind of shows Elizabeth's, I don't want to say superior complex, but she likes meaning when they speak to her, which kind of shows quirky, she's not like other girls. They get to London, they get to London, and Elizabeth is very happy and joyful to see that her sister is very healthy and lovely. They spend the day shopping and at the theater. Elizabeth gets to talk to her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. She finds out that Jane gave up her acquaintance with Miss Bingley because of the whole Mr. Bingley situation. And yeah, it's a good thing. Then the topic about Mr. Wickham comes up. So Mr. Wickham is now pursuing a young lady, Miss King. She was previously poor, but then when her grandfather died, she inherited his wealth, and so Wickham took a sudden interest in her due to her I don't know, her wealth. And Mrs. Gardiner comments on it, calling him a mercenary. And Elizabeth defends Wickham, stating that a man in distressed circumstances has not time for all those elegant decorums which other people may observe. And so I use this quote in the situation to represent the theme, which the theme is social structure. It's a pyramid, it says high, middle, lower. This is a quote. Yeah, so social structure is very prevalent throughout this section and throughout the whole book. Darcy not wanting to dance with Elizabeth because she's not in his class, Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy being against Jane and Mr. Bingley because of Jane's social status. Also Miss Bennet being desperate for her not only for her daughters to marry, but to marry a richer man. Also, Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins in order for her to have a comfortable life and not having to worry about being single and the social... Pamela. And her social...
Wait, what?
Shut up. I lost my thought. And her being poor class is a disadvantage if she's single. Okay, going on before I run out of time. That's the end of chapter 4. Oh, yeah. Oh, also, I want to comment on the fact that Elizabeth fails to see the similarities between Charlotte's situation and Mr. Wickham's situation, since she defends Mr. Wickham of marrying rich, or of being interested, being a mercenary, basically, and not Charlotte. She kind of feels ashamed of Charlotte, of what she's doing, marrying without love to Mr. Collins, and I guess stooping down to that level. But she soon gets comfortable with it, but it just shows how she views Mr. Wickham and how she views Charlotte. Okay, now moving on to chapter 5 of volume 2. Okay, so after London, they make their way to the original destination, which is at Hunsford. Elizabeth's remaining trip was enjoyable since she felt happier after seeing Jane and her aunt. doing well. As they arrive at their destination, Elizabeth notes that the personage was discernible, meaning like they can tell they were getting there because of the grandeur of like the gardens and like, I don't know. Elizabeth was affectionately greeted by both Charlotte and Mr. Collins. She noticed that when being shown around like the house, Mr. Collins would like seem to address her directly as if to tell her like, oh, look what you're missing for rejecting him. She also noticed that Charlotte kind of adapted to like being with Mr. Collins, because anything he would say that would be like shameful, she would like ignore it, and like the only thing that she like that would tell that she did notice it was like a faint blush that Elizabeth noticed from her. So as they head outside to like view the grounds, Mr. Collins wants to show him like around like the meadows, but since the women are wearing shoes and they can't really walk on the icy frost, I guess, they head back to the house, and Sir William and Mr. Collins go on ahead. Charlotte seems to be pleased by this, as she can now show her friend and her sister around without her husband. After dinner, where Elizabeth is informed that Lady Catherine and Mr. Borough, which is Lady Catherine's daughter, are both at Rosings and that they will be meeting them at church, Maria calls for Elizabeth in a hurry to come down. Elizabeth is scared by this because she seems so persistent, I guess. And so she goes down only to find the neighbor, Mrs. Jenkinson, I believe, and Mr. Borough. By seeing her, Elizabeth notes that she looks sickly and cross. And then she goes on to state, yes, she will do for him very well. She will make him a very proper wife. By him here, he's referring to Mr. Darcy. And she's kind of making fun of the fact that, like, because they're engaged, supposedly, according to Mr. Wickham. And she seems very, well, sick and cross. So, as it turns out, their presence there meant that the whole party, like Sir William, Maria, Charlotte, Mr. Collins, and Elizabeth, were invited to dine at Rosings the next day and spend the day there. And that's the end of chapter 5. Now in chapter 6 of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Collins continues to boast about Lady Catherine's generosity. They spend the whole day talking about it, which is annoying. Again, Mr. Collins-like. The day that they're gonna go have dinner, Mr. Collins he adds humor to the story by telling Elizabeth, do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us, which becomes herself and her daughter. So commenting on the fact that Lady Catherine is so high up the class and very elegant compared to, I guess, Elizabeth and themselves. Again, social structure. And it also shows how he puts her on a pedestal. They make their way to Rosings, and you can tell that Maria is very nervous. And that contrasts Elizabeth's, as the book states, courage that did not falter. And then once again, when they get in there and they're going to sit on the table, Sir William is greatly awed by the grandeur surrounding him, that he could barely speak, and the only thing he could muster to do is do like a small bow. And he sits down without saying a word. Maria is frightened, and she sits at the edge of her chair, not knowing which way to look. And that kind of contrasts, again, with how the book states Elizabeth found herself quite equal to the scene. So it shows her indifference, and it kind of shows her lack of interest in the money these people have. And it kind of goes against what you'll later see the prejudice Darcy holds against her family. Yeah. So, throughout the dinner, Elizabeth is doing, like, she notes many things. She notices many things. For example, Lady Catherine's way of speaking. She speaks with the tone of self-importance. And so Elizabeth comes to the conclusion that everything Wickham said about her was correct. She also notes that Miss Jabor was pale and sickly, and her features were insignificant, and she spoke very little. After their dinner, they go on to they go on to play cards, and they start to speak. And as they speak with with Lady Catherine, Elizabeth notices that she's very intrusive, and she likes giving her opinion on any matter, even unasked for. And she's what do we call it? Metiche. She's very she likes knowing other people's business because she likes commenting on it, basically. And she basically comments on the Bennett's family lack of raising their daughters. How, for example, lack of a governess to teach them education and stuff. And then as Lady Catherine keeps asking Jane questions about her family and commenting on the fact that they don't know how to play an instrument and sing, which is considered by Lady Catherine to be like, why wouldn't they know how to do that? And she kind of makes like very condescending comments as well, like saying like, oh yeah, well your class can't afford it, like it's understandable, but still you could have figured something out. And Jane Elizabeth kind of gets tired of it. So when Lady Catherine asked for her age when talking about like if her other siblings are married, Elizabeth kind of gives her attitude, but not really. Lady Catherine takes it as attitude from her when she asks for her age, and Elizabeth says, "Oh, it doesn't really matter to you." And so Lady Catherine kind of notes that. And that's the end of chapter 6.